Thank you very much. Welcome to today's webinar. This is an event co-sponsored by the Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference and the Project and Portfolio Leaders Forum. I am Ying Kwong, your moderator for today, and I'm happy to say that we have the opportunity to have Philip Lew to be speaking with us today about managing agile projects under uncertainty and organizational perspective. Next slide, please. Let me say a word about the Project and Portfolio Leaders Forum. This is a group of senior leaders and project-based organizations from both the private and public sectors. Most of the members are PMO managers, portfolio managers, and folks in IT leadership. There's a wide range of organizations, both in the private industry, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations. And over the last 15, 20 years, Jeff Altman has provided guidance and leadership to this group, and this group has grown. It's still, I think, primarily folks in the Portland metro areas and the large organizations in the Portland area and the state of Oregon. But also, over the years, with people coming and going, we also have other members in other states like California and Hawaii. Next slide, please. I think I'll let Phil speak to the background of the Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference, since Phil is the program chair.
Sure, thanks Ying-Ki. Yeah, as Ying-Ki was mentioning, the webinar today is co-sponsored by PPLF and PNSQC, and we are now in our 37th year, and we're actually the oldest software quality conference in North America. We have a conference every year in Portland, and this year is held on October 14th, so we hope that folks out there can submit a paper as well as come to the conference. What makes our organization unique really is that we call it a hybrid professional conference, in that we do require papers for those that want to present at the conference, and we don't have usually vendors or consultants pitching products, but really just folks sharing their real life experiences out in the field, whether they be successes or failures that we can all learn from. And our range of topics, I think it certainly would apply to today's audience, because just about everything involves software in some sense. And so today we're going to be talking about Agile and some of the risks involved. And I think that I'm hoping that the webinar will be very fruitful and productive for everyone. Just a small intro about myself. You'll read the bottom part in blue. It says, I never learned how to read. And I put that there because Ying-Ki was encouraging me to shorten the slides and so on, and I did. But I just wanted to mention that because I won't be going over every bullet point on the slide, but really touching upon highlights. And the slides, as well as the recording today, are really meant for the audience as a takeaway that they can review later and possibly think about with their colleagues. I'll let you introduce yourself, Ying-Ki.
Great, thanks. I'm Ying-Ki. Many people in state government just call me Ying. I've been with the Oregon State Government for about 15 years. I'm currently the statewide QA program manager. Before that, I provided IT investment oversight and also was the project manager for one of the larger projects in state government. I also work quite a bit in private industry, has quite a bit of experience in managing IT-enabled projects, programs, and enterprises. My work has been in quality and risk management and project management, but also I have a great interest in complex systems and like to volunteer for local nonprofits, including the PNSQC. Next slide, please. I'd like to give a little bit of background and motivation behind why we decided to do the webinar today. Phil and I presented a paper in October 2018 at PNSQC. It was specifically a subject of the quality and risk management, but from the perspective of enterprises that acquire systems. Needless to say, the emphasis of quality and risk management from the point of view of enterprises that acquire systems will be rather different than organizations that develop and deliver systems to such organizations. We cover a range of subjects in that paper. Some of it pertains to the importance of requirements, importance of testing, and managing organizational dynamics and things of that sort. After the presentation, which we have pretty positive feedback, but there was also feedback that I got from colleagues in state government and also from the private sector that said perhaps folks in leaderships, especially in project and portfolio management, as well as other business manager in organizations of greater complexity, can use a little bit better background on risk management, especially as it relates to Agile. The distinction between large organization and small obviously go along the line that enterprises of some size have greater complexity. And there is really a distinction between enterprise IT versus what might be referred to as mom and pop IT. We sometimes say that in state government, referring to some of the smaller agencies in government, and by the same token, smaller organizations in the private sector that may be serving state government or, of course, working in the private sector. So with that in mind, Phil and I today will be addressing some of the fundamental quality and risk management concerns when Agile is used from a little bit more fundamental perspective. Next slide, please. A few ground rules about today's webinar. Just a reminder that participants will be muted. Questions can be sent through the Zoom user interface. And people can feel free to ask questions through the Zoom interface, and we will try to answer them as they come up. Currently, I see that we have a fair number of participants. Looks like 49 people are signed on, and we're looking forward to finish the presentation portion of this, which will take about 25 to 30 minutes, and then going into a discussion period. Phil and I will be engaging in a discussion, partly driven by the questions that you folks provided. And then if there's a need, we will unmute participants if that's turn out to be a need. So with that said, now our featured speaker, Phil, will be giving us a presentation.
Great, thanks, Ying. I think I mentioned just earlier about software being prevalent all over the place, and I think it's one of the things that we don't realize, though, is that there's a lot of risks and fragileness to having software in our lives just about everywhere, not only in our personal lives, but in our business lives. And the thing is that there's a lot of risks that we don't think about. And so today what we're going to be talking about is the risk present in Agile and the process itself, and how we can enumerate and think about those risks, and of course, mitigate them. So, I tried to think about how to organize the presentation today, and I found it hard to think about things in a sequential way, one thing leading to the next. And rather, I decided to organize today's discussion in terms of buckets of thinking. And so I used kind of a mind map approach, starting with Agile risks in the center and thinking about the impacts or influences and relationships between some of the outlying squares you see on the agenda there. So we have reasons for failure, we have uncertainty and probabilities, which always apply to risks, as well as the process itself of Agile, that how the certain parts of the process bring up risks. And then, of course, there's the usual risk categorization and types of risks. And one of the other things that I'd like to talk about today is a little bit more detail about uncertainty and probabilities, and understanding those uncertainties and probabilities a little bit deeper than we normally think about. So I think, and you notice I tend to color code things, and I'd like to touch on especially the things that are coded in blue. We're all trying to go faster, right? Agile is all about speed and velocity, or at least that's what a lot of people think Agile is about. And as you know, when you drive faster, you tend to crash or have higher probability of crashing, which is why they have speed limits. The other thing that's really important is people talk a lot about communication and collaboration, but as you know, that involves more than just talking to each other, but the content and manner in which that happens. And I think that that's something that's missing today. And you see a lot of people talking about how to collaborate, how to communicate, the lost art of communication, and so on. So, I'd encourage you in each of your organizations to really think deeper about, what communication and collaboration means and how to make it more effective for your organization, because it's more than just, having meetings, right? This is, if you think about Agile, as I mentioned before, velocity and reaching for velocity in itself brings on lots of risks. And what happens is, I think that we tend to think about velocity and sprints and iterations, and maybe we look at our velocity charts and we say, oh, great, we have good velocity here, our velocity is increasing. And then we look at our sprints and we say, okay, good, we accomplished this many story points for this sprint, and so on. And the thing is that a lot of times we don't really look at the content of those story points. And I think what happens a lot is that we have a mismanagement of backlog, and that sometimes we end up dividing stories up because they're too big. And at the end, they're not complete enough to the point where our users are satisfied with what we developed. Or we may develop them incorrectly because, especially for complex features, they weren't detailed enough for us to really get our hands and thoughts around them. And so those are the primary reasons, I believe, for risks inserting themselves into the Agile process. This is just kind of a background for those that are not that familiar with Agile. It's a typical Agile, I guess you could say, workflow or chart, and this one in particular is for Scrum. As you know, there's many different flavors of Agile. Agile is really just a set of principles based on getting quick feedback and having an iterative process where you present things to users so that you can get that feedback. So I won't go into this in any detail really, but rather dividing it into sections. And I call this number one section the product management section, or the process of figuring out what you're going to be working on and how to deliver it. And the second number is actually doing the development part of it. And then the third section is based on looking at what you did and understanding your reasons for success and failure and trying to improve on a continuous basis. So before we dig into risks, I think that one of the things we like to, or at least I like to examine with our clients is, why did we fail? It's important to understand failure in order to understand success. So in some of the seminars that I've done, I always have folks vote on their top 3 reasons. We won't have a vote here, but I'd like you to, just take a moment to think about what you think are the top 3 reasons for failure, and think about how you can avoid those failures. And don't forget that you can input comments as well as questions into either the chat window or the question panel. You're welcome to contribute anytime, and I'll try to take on questions and comments as well. One of the we just got a question right here. Agile Fall. Agile Fall is really a combination of waterfall and Agile, where people are trying to implement Agile, but they still fall back on waterfall methodologies, which eventually leads to failure because you can't really combine them together. You can't really do waterfall quicker with Agile methods. If there's any other questions, feel free to ask. Thanks for the question, Jessica. Let's see here. Okay, so in based on the surveys and votes that I've done in previous seminars that we've conducted, I think the top 3 are requirements churn, lack of test automation, and process inconsistency, which is also related to Agile Fall, the question that Jessica was bringing up. So those usually are the top 3. If you think that others are, should be up there, certainly feel free to input your comments in the question panel. So where does risk come from? And I'm going to be talking about the different types of risk now. And so, risks come from many sources. A lot of people like to categorize them, and I kind of tend to group them in people, process, product, and in larger organizations, you have a lot of partners that are providing pieces of your software or pieces of your product or a special expertise for your project. May have subcontractors, right, that you work with if you're in the government environment, as Ying is. And then you have specific types of risks that could probably be grouped in those buckets there. And I'm sure this list of risks is not exhaustive for sure, but I like to list out some of them and then kind of just organize my thoughts or create kind of a risk model. And I kind of divide risks into different types of categories like this in terms of product, process, technology, people, but also context and business risks, customer risks or end users, and the actual delivery of the product. I know I'm going kind of fast here, but feel free to ask questions in the chat window or in the Q&A panel.
A quick note from the moderator here, Ying speaking.
Yep.
I think this is a very typical risk taxonomy that might be employed in just about any organization with any system development lifecycle. So in that sense, I think Agile, like any system development lifecycle methodology, would ultimately need to link to risk taxonomy like this, which should be very familiar with PMPs and other types of project managers.
Thanks, Ying. So, in terms of technology risks, I'm actually just going to go over a couple of those buckets. A lot of times we find that we have third-party tools that we can't integrate with as well as we'd like, or we have skill problems that are related to those technologies. Other types of technology risks include the platform that we're using and being able to adapt to what we needed to do as our needs change or as our requirements change or as our users change, right? Sometimes, especially say 5 years ago, as users were transforming to mobile, we had to then have technologies that would enable us to have platform agnostic applications. And sometimes those platforms, we needed to actually just change them out. We may also have logic that is too hard to implement in the current technology stack, different types of complexities and integration. So a lot of those technology risks, I bring these up because those are really fundamental risks that really need to be addressed really early on in the project, in the architecture, which really requires, I guess you could say, some futuristic thinking in terms of what is going to be coming down the pike in our users, as well as new technologies and directions. Who could have predicted that, cloud would be, the mainstay of applications when they first brought about SaaS, right? But here we are today. In terms of product risks, I think one of the biggest product risks is that features or functions end up being too hard or a lot more complex than we thought, and then we end up not delivering them and moving it to the backlog for now. I have that as a quote because I've heard that so many times, right? How many people have not heard that one? And so what ends up happening is if you don't deliver those key features or those ones that would differentiate yourself from your competitors, then you end up being like everybody else. And you end up having a mediocre product that, even though it works, it may not be what you originally intended out to be in terms of something that will differentiate you from your competitors. Process risk, I like to use the word fragile, and this gets back to one of the key reasons for failure is that when you try to combine or move directly from waterfall to agile, and you bring with you so many components of the waterfall process, but just try to speed them up, it doesn't tend to work very well. And in terms of being not repeatable, I think that a lot of folks think that agile is really just do whatever you want to and so forth, but really agile does have a fairly stringent process and a cadence to it. It is adaptable. So it's something that each organization needs to find itself in terms of its own agile process. But there are inherent risks in adapting to that process, and there no doubt will be failures as you hone your process and develop it over the iterations. Of course, there are the typical risks in terms of having a superhero and so on, and there's ways to deal with having superheroes. Mentorship is one. At one point in my organization, I noticed that I had a superhero, and what I did, if you've read the book Linked by Albert Bassi, when you think about why Google is so smart, it's because they have links to everywhere out there, right? So if you have a superhero, they're like Google, getting information from everybody else because everybody else goes to the superhero with their problems. And so what I did to purposefully alleviate the superhero was to create mentors inside the organization so that new hires would go to their assigned mentor with their problems, and therefore that mentor would gather knowledge and become a mini superhero, I guess you could say. So you can actually create superheroes within your organization so that the knowledge and problem-solving capability is dispersed. There's a lot of things you can do to combat that natural occurrence. Next I'd like to talk a little bit about all risks not being the same. And I think this is really important to think about in terms of uncertainty and probabilities. Most of us think about the typical risk management approach where you have an event and then you have a probability, maybe you assign it high, medium, low, or 0.6 or 0.8 or 0.9, whatever. And then you do that multiplication and you have an impact, right? And so the thing that we're not aware of is that we subconsciously think that everything is uses the normal distribution when it comes to what happens, the probability of an occurrence. And so this is what we have when we have grades in school, right? So you have a normal distribution. You think about, and this kind of
follows us wherever we go in thinking about the probability of an occurrence, right? So you have what's called the bell curve, which is a standard normal distribution where you have very few people that get Fs and very few people that get As. And most people are in the Cs and B minus to C minus category there in the middle. And what this shows is that a typical normal distribution, which would also apply to other things in life, where you have very small, what we call tails in the bottom half and the top half of the distribution, and most people are in the middle. And you see this here in this particular model where you have a low uncertainty, right? So you're very certain that most of the people are going to be in the middle part and very few are going to be in the tails in the blue curve. Where you have a high uncertainty model would be a flatter model where you have a lot of outliers there that constitute the probability of those occurrences. And so the problem in thinking about risks being totally normal, like the blue model, is that you assign a very low probability to those outliers when really you shouldn't. And if you do assign a low probability to those outliers and they happen to be things that lead to ruin of a project, such as maybe a key person leaving or maybe a technology stack not working out the way that you wanted to, that could really be the demise and failure of your project.
I'd like to add a kind of small comment in that,
Sure.
We talk about story points or functional requirements, however you describe the business needs of an organization in a system. Not all the story points or requirements are created equal in the sense that some are inherently more difficult. So I think sometimes people feel that they have a good handle on the requirements in terms of the number of story points assigned, and one can get very complacent around, looking at the number of story points and seeing that, you have this forward march in terms of a good velocity of delivering the story points, that everything is going well. But, as was kind of mentioned earlier by Phil, you could have a situation where things are put in the backlog, may not have been estimated correctly and potentially reflect large risk to a particular project. And then I think those are among the things that the probability and the impact thing needs to be weighted by the fact that people could make mistakes in estimates, and it's very important to constantly review given current understanding.
Right. So I wanted to touch on a couple of examples here that the normal distribution does apply to. You thought about the height of our grades, that's one, but in school, but the height of the people in the room. If you take the average height of someone, say, being 5'9" or 5'10", and you did a survey and you calculated the average height of men and women in the room and you calculated their standard deviation, what you'd find is the average height of men is about 5'10" with a standard deviation of 4. So if you take if you use, and this is where the term 6 sigma comes, right? You have 3 sigmas with 3 standard deviations on the left side and 3 standard deviations on the right side. So 3 standard deviations from 5'10" would be 6'10". And what you see is that there are very few people that are 6'10", right? So that shows a very typical application of the normal distribution, where you have most people all centered in the middle and very few people that are 6'10" or even 6'6", right? Very small chances. On the other hand, if you were to take, for instance, the average and standard deviation of revenue from documentary movies, you would find that the average revenue is $11 million and the standard deviation is $17 million. And this really shows the impact of all these things in the outlying tails that could happen that you don't think about have really a high probability of happening. So my point here is that when you think about a risk, think about the outlying probability that will happen. And it's probably, some of them are going to be a lot higher in terms of probability of occurrence than you think. And so the thing is really how do we assess these risks and, of course, decrease their probability? And one of the things that Agile helps us to do is that we have to purposefully have activities that make us think about, enumerate, and assess these risks. And really, probability, why is that important? It really changes the whole conversation when you think about Agile, when you talk to your management. You know, one of the typical questions is, can you get this done, right? And so I think the answer should be, well, that depends on how much risk and certainty you want, right? So if we get it done next week, well, there may be a fairly high probability that it won't work correctly. Or maybe a fair probability, a high probability that it won't include exactly the feature that you want. So I'd invite you to think about the questions that your boss may ask you and how you can answer them in terms of probability versus yes, no, and let them make a choice in terms of the risks associated with delivering faster, because there are risks involved. Risks are not in our favor. You know, there are a lot of hidden risks because of opacity between the components that we're using, whether it be components in software or components in projects, right? So you have project components, subcontractors, where you can't see exactly what is going on with them, and that presents hidden risks. And like I said before, faster is not safer. Risk is definitely not decreasing as we move forward in the technologies and processes that we're using. And so I think about, why do we ignore risks? Of course, we're focused on velocity. We want to get done functionality. A lot of times we do the easy stuff first, as Ying was mentioning, in terms of harder, complex user stories or features. And that ends up pushing out risks further down the road, or kicking the can down the road. Sometimes we may use risk management processes that are too heavy. You've seen a lot of people with, if you have a large project, you may have somebody that's totally in charge of risks and drawing up risk charts and so on. And sometimes less is more, right? So, I invite you to think about why it is that in your projects that you forget or ignore risks as well. Another reason we ignore risks is that we are overconfident, and overconfidence is natural. Who wants to hang out at a meeting and listens to somebody that's all doom and gloom when actually they may be just enumerating real risks, right? There also is a tendency, I'm sure that many of you have read the book on Thinking Fast and Slow. There's certainly a tendency to want to believe and make ourselves right, as well as paying attention to mostly current and now information versus information that has happened in the past, which probably could have an equally or higher impact. We all want to be right, that's for sure. So one of the ways to combat this is to have what's called a pre-mortem. And a pre-mortem, I guess you could say, gives permission for everybody to be gloom and doom. And instead of having one person in the room be the negative person, you could have everybody put on their negative hat and really think about the risks involved, and kind of gives permission to be a pessimist. And this is one of the techniques that I've used before, where it helps people to really bring about and bring up risks in a very safe environment, so that everybody doesn't have to be optimistic. So, okay, so this section really is risk within the Agile process, and I'm going to kind of just skim through these and we can discuss them. as I said before, I'm going to be talking about the stuff in blue because I don't know how to read. So let's go through some of these. Risk during Agile or not. There's the section number 1, which I talked about before, which is product management. There's the sprint itself, and then there's the retrospective. This particular exercise is designed for a workshop where I break groups into small groups and people list out risks, but obviously today it's just a webinar. Product management, lots of risks there. I think probably the most important thing is here is, as you know, scope creep and really understanding a feature as deep as possible in the beginning and making good estimates on that. Other risks, you know, definition of done, and this also has to do with scope creep and really allocating the time to define what done really means very carefully.
Phil, we have a kind of an interesting question here.
Sure.
Many of the terms you use are not necessarily specific to Agile per se, because even waterfall and other traditional development methods, project managers would have to deal with scope creep and things of that sort. Do you think, and the question is along the line of, with Agile, are there specific concerns in terms of controlling scope creep?
Is there special concerns in Agile for controlling scope creep, or possibly? Yeah, scope creep tends to be a typical problem in Agile in terms of iterations end up containing more than they should, and people throw things into iterations, and then a particular iteration may grow in terms of what it should contain versus what you outlined in the planning meeting. And so what we do for that, of course, is, well, you know, what goes in must come out. So if you input something that has a certain estimated size of, you know, let's just use a t-shirt size of medium or 5-man days, whatever you want to use in terms of your units, and then that means you must take something out, and so of equal size. And so that's a lot of times that happens, but maybe you're talking about the scope creep of a feature, particular feature growing. And in that case, the way that Agile would address that would be actually taking a epic approach and converting a user story and actually adding to a user story and breaking that user story down into smaller pieces and putting it into the backlog.
We have a related question from Thomas Sullivan. So what if you can't know the definition of done at the outset? And this is a very important question for and a purpose for using Agile in the first place, is that sometimes we don't have definitive requirements, at least captured in detail. So that seems to present particular challenges to project managers when it comes to controlling scope creep.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, I just worked on a requirements workshop, and one of the things about putting stuff into a sprint as far as a feature or a user story is that you don't put it in until you have a clear definition of done. So it doesn't actually get put into a sprint until you have a definition of done. So that's certainly one way of blocking that from happening. But I think that maybe the question is, you know, that you have a lot of things that you're working on that you don't know what it would be anyway. You don't really know what the feature is. And Agile is really designed to address that as well. And what you have to do is make your definition of done be more of an exploratory definition of done. In other words, you know, we're going to work on this to the point where we have determined that this feature will have, you know, 3 outcomes, or further define the feature rather than have the feature done by itself. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I hope so.
Yeah. we have a more of a comment here from one of the attendees that said along the line that in a government kind of setting or highly regulatory environment, industries that are highly regulated, sometimes the minimal viable products may actually have a lot of features because of the complexity of business rules, and the regulations themselves may lead to certain requirements that with the best of intentions cannot necessarily be streamlined. And I think that's where one has to be extra cautious about putting things in the backlog. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about taking story points, maybe labeling them in certain ways that, like, you know, these are the must-haves, and these one can be more creative with in terms of streamlining or pushing it in the backlog. Would that be normally done? I think was the one of the questions.
Well, I mean, that gets down to backlog management and how you decide to prioritize things as a team, right? So, excuse me. I mean, I would say that is really up to the Scrum Master and the product owner to decide how you're going to approach things in the backlog and move them into sprints as you go along. Each company will vary on how on their, I guess you could say, policy or philosophy and how they develop their product. Let me go on here
Go ahead.
quickly here, because I can see that there's lots of discussion, and perhaps some people on the other hand may want to see the slides as well, but they will be available in the recording. You know, in terms of the sprint itself, you know, taking care of risks, one of the couple things that are really important is reviewing the stories to ensure acceptance criteria are clear. And this was brought up in terms of definition of done as well, which was just the question that was just raised. One of the things that people often don't do is really think clearly about acceptance criteria, but also some common other criteria would be performance testing as well. Other things to think about that end up being within the sprint and possible big risks are usability of the product. And so I like to have heuristic as well as quick and dirty observational usability testing. You could call it hallway usability testing before things are quote unquote done and too late. Another thing in terms of retrospectives, one of the key things to really examine in terms of your scope creep, and this is related to a previous question, was examining your unplanned work and where the unplanned work comes from. And this gets back to one of the things I mentioned just a minute ago in terms of stuff coming into an iteration or a sprint and not taking things out, or if you have something that doesn't have a clear definition of done and it keeps growing and growing beyond what you thought it was, then you really need to look at your estimates and your estimating process. Or as one of the, Nahush mentioned on his comment there, he's talking about the different types of people, you know, junior versus senior, and thinking about the estimation points based on the experience of the individual that's taking on that story. And that's an important comment as well. Retrospectives, again, you know, I think that, and this gets to estimating errors, whether you're assigned a junior or a senior person to it, as well as definitions of done and the granularity of that in terms of why you estimated incorrectly. Just as there are categorizations for defects, right? You think about, why did we have this defect? Was it a coding error? Was it a documentation error? Was it a requirements error? You also have to think about categorizing your estimation errors too. And by categorizing your estimation errors and really examining your estimation errors, then you can really get better at it, right? So I think it's important to really think deeply about why you're incorrect on your estimations.
We have an interesting question here about estimation along the line of, you know, sometimes the story points for certain complex business logic area might have been underestimated. And in circumstances like that, you kind of have a situation where what PMP would refer to as the traditional schedule risk and the budget risk may be hard to quantify. And this relates to Nahush's question about estimation, is that how would one kind of get a better sense as to kind of the risk associated with items that may or may not have been accurately estimated?
Yeah, I'm not quite. Is that a question or a comment, Ying? I'm not quite.
It's a comment in
Oh,
the
okay.
sense that it's a comment that basically suggests the challenges in uncertainty and therefore risk associated with assigned story points in the backlog.
Okay. Yeah, another question that from Nahush is in terms of product management and product backlog, and they don't have a clear product backlog, and how would you recommend an organization create such a group? And that's really interesting because I'm working with a client now that actually has a problem with their backlog in terms of one guy controls the backlog, and it really should be more than one person that's involved in creating the backlog. It should be folks from product management, the product owner, right? They certainly should have a say, but also the Scrum Master or the scheduler, because they're aware of the resources that are available to complete those things. So like was mentioned earlier about the level of expertise that's available to complete the tasks. We're human beings, so we do go on vacation, and we do have different levels of expertise. And maybe at that point, you really assess that you need different members on your team as well. So that's very important to think about. In terms of retrospectives, one of the things that usually comes up is the ambiguity and completeness of user stories, as well as assumptions that are made. And this is really part of the grooming process of a backlog and the grooming process of stories. And that is a critical element in terms of leading to agile success. I think it's a misnomer that we don't have detailed requirements, specifications, some thick book that you would have in a government project, but we have user stories, and they too have to have a very detailed level in order for somebody to go and develop them, right? So you may not have some thick book that has a title on it, requirements, specifications, and some according to some ISO number, but we do need very focused and very detailed specifications for somebody to go out and start building it. And there is the school that, we just go along as we can and we figure it out as we go. But then, that has to be part of the definition of done. Like I was saying earlier, maybe your definition of done is, well, it's explored to this point until we decide on exactly what the feature would be. One more thing in terms of retrospectives, in terms of, when you do have a retrospective, it's important to record your results and your action items. And what I've seen very helpful is that, you have a retrospective, and of course you have all these reasons for things that didn't go quite as well as you wanted them to, and you have all these action items, but if you could just prioritize them and treat those own things, those improvement areas as a backlog in themselves, and prioritize, say, one or two, and really put that on a whiteboard or put it open for everyone to see that we're focusing on this improvement area for the next iteration, then that really helps a lot. I'm just going to kind of whiz through this here, get to more questions and Q&A. Let's see here. At the end of the day, here it is that we're trying to we need to enumerate our risks and really think about mitigating them. Mitigating means reducing the probability that they happen, eliminating them, or sometimes it may be agreeing and accepting to do nothing. And I think that's about it for today. I think we've covered quite a bit. I tried to organize it in a way that kind of made sense. I used a mind map approach, and I'll leave you with this quote about from Deming, that it's not enough to do your best, you must know what to do and then do your best. So I hope that we've kind of covered some of the things to do in terms of enumerating and assessing and managing risks in the Agile process. And I'll end that here with today, and you can just ask questions here. You can raise your hand in the control panel, put in questions in the chat panel. I'm hoping that you all submit an abstract for the conference that we have coming up on October 14th. You could submit an abstract at pnsqc.org and share your experiences on in your own projects, failures as well as successes that we can all learn from. So thank you for today.
Phil, we have...
I'll just take questions. Yeah, I see there's a question from Jessica. Huh?
Yes, and I also have another question. Let me start with the one that I've collected earlier, and that
Sure.
is, in traditional project management, the kind that some of us are certified, by the Project Management Institute, one of the key things that one do is to create the work breakdown structure, and when you kind of add up all the lines, and that should equal to 100% of the project work. Is that an outdated way of thinking about the scope of work?
Wow, that's a big one.
Yes.
Well, I mean, work breakdown structure has to do with breaking down each little feature and assuming that some things can happen in parallel, whereas some things can happen, must happen sequentially. And I would say that, what Agile does is just changes the parallelness and sequentialness of a work breakdown structure. So in other words, you might have a work breakdown structure that consists of sprints, and certain features in some sprints later on down the road, further down the timeline, are dependent on earlier sprints because you need that feature to work before you work on the next feature. So I wouldn't say that they're diametrically opposed, but actually they're compatible and can build on each other.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and tie back to the paper that you and I wrote, Phil, that we mentioned that sometimes for certain types of projects, it's very important to overlay waterfall-like structures on top of the Agile sprints as a way to verify and validate that required features actually have been delivered. And I think, in highly regulatory environments and projects like that, there probably is a place for where from time to time you kind of take a breather and take a look at whether certain required features have been delivered, or are they sort of hopelessly trapped in the backlog, so to speak. We have a question earlier about where one can learn more about the bell curves and the application of statistical thinking in assessing risk. Phil, you probably are good at giving us some information about that.
Yeah, I think the traditional bell curve, as I said, was a typical normal distribution with very, very thin tails in terms of, very few people get Fs and very few people get A pluses, right? But if you were to Google something, for example, say fat tail distributions, you probably would find a good amount of information on it there.
Great. We have a question from Jeff. You want to take that, Phil? More a
Jeff.
comment. It says that a good alternative to traditional work breakdown structure in an uncertain environment is rolling wave, WBS, and planning. So this kind of begs the general question as to, kind of what are the additional alternative way to thinking about scope of work aside from the traditional PMP view that you add up all the lines and then you get 100%, so to speak, from the get-go.
Wow, we're getting a lot of comments in here, and I think they're kind of all related actually with
Yeah. About WBS, I guess that
about the
generated.
WBS. Moss is mentioning about having a rolling a release plan, and a release plan is really a different viewpoint of a WBS in terms of step by step, a sequential pattern of what you're going to be releasing and what is included in it in each release, building up to the final product or project when it's finished. And that kind of meshes in with Jeff's comment about an alternative to a traditional WBS, having a rolling wave WBS, which includes planning. That's certainly, you could call it a hybrid WBS. I think what's the main point here is that the WBS is not necessarily outdated and archaic, but it can be adapted and changed.
Yeah, and I think the future of software quality is probably along the line of iterative development, in the sense that as people or as organizations learn collectively about one's business needs, business objectives, and things like that, one need kind of opportunity to morph requirements as previously understood. And I think probably the easiest way to manage risk is to create phases and maybe to group different sprints as important releases. And I think that's Moss's comment here, is
right.
to examine whether overall release plan in terms of specific product or project would be possible. We just got a question here from Joshua. It's also a very interesting question. They say, what are your thoughts or recommendations for measuring success in reducing risk and in achieving better software? And before I let Phil respond to this, I kind of like to comment that, traditional software quality way of thinking, per people like Capers Jones that wrote books about the economics of software quality, he clearly looked at agile methodology as an important way to prevent defects, by engaging stakeholder, working closely with developers, that there's a better probability that requirement defects can be detected earlier. With that in mind, I'll let Phil comment further about other ways of reducing risks that's not necessarily along the way of finding bugs.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I wouldn't expect an easy question to come from Joshua. But I'll first comment on the thing about it isn't just about reduce bugs, and that is certainly true. Actually, these days, I think most people expect your software to work and not be broken, right? So really it's a question of how can we measure success other than having mistakes, obvious mistakes. And so I think that success should be really measured based on one of the things that Joshua says here in terms of customer feedback and customer satisfaction. And so there's a whole industry out there in terms of trying to understand the user and the customers and what they think, what they want, and how happy they are. So really it gets to understanding the users and being able to collect their feedback and what they want for future releases on the product, and how happy they are with the current product, and being able to incorporate what they want into your releases going forward. So there are, I'm sure that you could, after you do figure out what customers and users want, and you could actually develop some ways to think about in terms of how you satisfy and how fast you're able to satisfy those needs and wants as a measure of success, rather than simply eliminating defects, because that's expected now. You can't use that as the bar. We're beyond that, I think.
I like to comment a little bit about kind of in a highly regulatory type environments and software that where the minimum viable product may contains quite a bit of complexity and feature functions. I think in that situation, the typical thing to do is to involve subject matter experts, and sometimes the subject matter experts in the private sectors are champions for the user community, and I think these are all good. Of course, one of the challenge where subject matter experts are concerned in government organization as well as in complex large enterprises is that sometimes the best subject matter experts may not actually be available to a project. I know that may seem strange to some companies that maybe as a matter of culture or policy always make available the best subject matter experts, but I've seen projects where the best subject matter experts are not necessarily available, and then in so doing, you may have kind of deficiency in folks that advocate for the user community, or you may have deficiency along kind of deep understanding of regulatory requirements and other type of requirements, and those are particularly trying and challenging situation to deal with, because you are kind of ultimately dealing with finite resources that may not be available when you need it.
Okay, well, it sounds like I don't see any more questions coming in, Ying. Did you have
Yeah, I think like to thanks everybody for participating. We have still 30 plus people that's with us, and that reflects a great level of interest and enthusiasm for Phil's talk. We appreciate Phil taking the time to present to us today and to lead discussions at different points during the presentations. As I indicated, Phil and I have made a presentation in the last PNSQC on quality and risk management in enterprises that acquire software systems. And if there's an interest, let us know, and maybe we'll think about another one of these events in the future. Thank you very much for all of your time, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.